The coffee tin sat open beneath Irene Bell's brass scoop when Caleb Voss asked why she kept filling it, for a man who never stayed long enough to drink a cup with her. Irene leveled the dark grounds with a wooden measure, careful not to spill what had taken 3 weeks to cross the mountains. Because Owen Marsh paid for coffee, she said. Caleb leaned against the mercantile counter. At 52, widowed 6 years, he owned a shop 2 streets over and made every opinion sound practical. He pays for half of what you put in there. He pays what I charge. That is not the same thing. Around them, Bell Mercantile smelled of lamp oil, wool, coffee, and damp boots. Irene's brother Eli weighed nails near the rear shelves, pretending not to hear. Caleb tapped the dented tin. A woman ought to know when kindness has become a habit for someone else. Irene took a scrap from a damaged order sheet. A man living 12 miles above Pine Ridge ought to know when the East Road is turning soft. She wrote in small, firm letters. Warm wind since Saturday. Creek running high. Take the Ridge Road home. Caleb read it upside down. The freight driver crossed east this morning. The sun has been on that slope since noon yesterday. She folded the note twice and pressed it beneath the grounds. The doorbell rang. Owen Marsh entered with cold on his coat and melting snow along his hat brim. At 63, he stood straight, though winter had silvered his beard and deepened the quiet around his eyes. He stopped beyond the doorway. Irene knew from Caleb's face that Owen had heard enough. Owen removed his gloves. My tin ready? It is. He laid 3 coins on the counter. Irene pushed one back. That is too much. Last week you said the shipment cost more. Not that much more. Owen glanced at Caleb. Caleb nodded. We were discussing the road. I heard. Owen placed 2 fingers over the lid before Irene could close it. What road? The East Crossing. I think runoff has weakened the approach. Tom Dyer brought freight through at 9. It was 20 degrees colder at 9. Owen looked toward the windows. Water dripped from the awning while gray clouds gathered over the western ridge. The Ridge Road adds 6 miles and keeps your wagon above the creek. Caleb straightened. Tom knows those roads better than anybody hauling freight in this county. Irene met Owen's eyes. Tom knows what the crossing looked like this morning. I know what 3 warm days do to frozen clay beneath running water. A customer near the stove turned to listen. Owen lifted the tin. Its painted label had nearly vanished, and one corner was crushed inward. His late wife had once carried it into the store every month, before coffee became something Owen bought only for hard weather. Did you put that in writing? He asked. Under the grounds. Something in his face eased. You trust your figures? I trust the mountain. The clock marked 3:15. Owen could still reach the East Crossing before dark. The Ridge Road would leave him climbing the last mile beneath a failing sky. Eli brought forward Owen's flour and lamp oil. Storm may reach us by sundown. Owen carried the goods to his wagon while Irene stood beneath the awning. Meltwater ran brown along the street. The East Road curved down toward the creek. The Ridge Road climbed north beneath black timber. Owen tied the coffee tin beside the wagon seat and gathered the reins. For one long moment, his team faced the shorter East Road. Thunder rolled behind the mountains. Somewhere below town, the creek struck timber with a sound like a door breaking loose. Owen looked toward Irene, then down at the 2 roads dividing beyond his horses. He pulled the left rein. The team turned away from the creek and started up the Ridge Road, just as rain struck the wagon cover in hard, slanting drops. The extra miles cost him the last clean light of afternoon. Mud gathered around the wheels, and wind pressed through the pines with a low, steady groan. Twice he climbed down to clear branches from the road. By the time the trail curved above the East Crossing, dusk had settled over the valley. From the ridge, he could see the creek boiling brown beneath the bridge approach. The bank on the near side had broken away. Half the road hung over moving water, with wagon ruts ending at open mud. A team trying to cross in darkness would have put its right wheels into the washout before the driver saw it. Owen stood beside his horses, rain running from his hat brim. Then he reached into the coffee tin. Irene's note smelled faintly of fresh grounds. He read it once beneath the wagon lantern, folded it along the same creases, and slipped it into the inner pocket of his coat. The detour kept his wagon whole, but it did not save the daylight. Near the final climb, one wheel struck a buried stone and loosened a trace chain. Owen spent 20 minutes repairing it with numb fingers. He reached the ranch after full dark and carried in only flour, lamp oil, coffee, and salt before the rain hardened into sleet. A crate of window glass remained at Bell Mercantile because he had chosen supplies the ranch could not do without. By the following Monday, the storm had cleared, leaving the streets of Pine Ridge ridged with frozen wagon tracks. Irene heard Owen's boots before she saw him. She had already set his usual measure of coffee beneath the counter, though she told herself it was only because 2 freight Mondays remained before the winter route closed. Owen placed the tin before her. "The east approach is gone," he said. Caleb, examining stove hinges at the far end of the counter, turned his head. Irene lifted the lid. "How much?" "Enough to take a wagon if a man saw it too late." She did not smile. Being right about danger was no reason to look pleased. "I am glad you took the ridge. So am I." Owen's words were quiet, but he had said them where Caleb and Eli could hear. Irene reached for the scoop. "You left the window glass." "I left what could wait." She measured the grounds, then pulled the freight book closer. "The glass can go next Monday, but if you carry it, you will need to move 1 sack of oats to the final run." "My team needs the oats. Then the glass waits until spring." Owen looked toward the frost-clouded window. One pane in his south room had been cracked since October. Irene turned the book around and showed him her figures. Lamp oil, flour, salt, and oats first. "Glass does not keep a horse fed." His mouth moved at one corner. "You always settle a question before a man finishes asking it." "Only the expensive ones." For a moment, warmth passed between them without needing a name. Then Owen reached to steady the tin as Irene poured. The movement tilted it toward her. Beneath the rim, between the fresh grounds and the metal wall, a folded scrap of paper appeared. The paper was not the note from last week. Its edge had darkened with coffee oil, and the fold had been softened by handling. Irene recognized her own handwriting. "Cold week coming." She had written those words before Christmas. Her hand stopped above the tin. Owen followed her gaze. His fingers closed around the lid, and the old hinge gave a sharp click as he pressed it down. Too quickly. The note disappeared beneath the metal. Irene looked at him. Owen lifted the tin from the counter before she could see whether the folded paper was alone. Black ice smeared the leather cover of the next freight ledger, and the driver had written a warning in the margin: early freeze above 8,000 feet. Irene read the line twice, then opened Owen's account. His order had been placed in October, when the weather still promised an ordinary winter. 4 sacks of flour, 1 crate of lamp oil, 2 blocks of salt, oats enough for 6 weeks, coffee measured as if he expected to drink it only on mornings when cold entered the house through the walls. She took out a fresh sheet and began again. Owen kept 28 head through winter, plus 2 wagon horses and a milk cow. The north pasture had iced over early. That meant more hay hauled by hand, more lantern hours in the barn, and more salt used to keep the cattle drinking. By the time he entered Bell Mercantile, Irene had crossed out half his original load. Owen stopped at the counter. "Something wrong. Your order was made for a mild winter." "I did not order one of those." "You ordered like you expected one." She turned the figures toward him. To keep the freight weight unchanged, she had removed window glass, a new wash basin, and 1 box of nails. In their place, she added lamp oil, salt, oats, and another small sack of flour. Owen followed the columns with one blunt finger. "That much salt. Your cattle will reach frozen grass before they reach good water. If they stop drinking, they stop eating." Eli came from the storeroom carrying a crate. "The wagon is nearly sealed." "Then unseal it," Irene said. The freight driver protested until she showed him the total weight had not changed. Owen helped shift the crates himself, lifting the lamp oil into the protected center and moving the oats away from the wagon's damp rear flap. The work drew attention. 2 ranch wives waited near the fabric shelves. Caleb stood beside the stove with a parcel under his arm. Each person watched Irene direct a 63-year-old rancher as if she had been managing isolated winter loads all her life. When the last rope was tied, Owen looked over the wagon bed. "That should hold until the final run. If the cold stays where it is, and if it drops, come back Monday instead of waiting 2. He gave one short nod, then Monday. Inside. Irene reached for the coffee scoop, and the handle twisted loose in her palm. Owen took it from her. "You have wire." She brought him a narrow piece from beneath the counter. He tightened the handle, bound the split wood, and tested it against the edge of the bin. Ugly repair, he said. It only has to hold coffee. That is how ugly repairs become permanent. Irene poured a cup from the mercantile pot and set it beside him. Owen hesitated, then remained at the counter instead of carrying the tin straight to his wagon. They drank while she checked his revised invoice. A rancher near the stove glanced at the heavier salt line. Marsh, you opening a trading post up there? Owen folded the invoice once. No. Then Bell has sold you half the store? Irene kept me from buying the wrong half. The room quieted in a way that felt different from ridicule. Eli returned the account book without correcting her figures. One of the ranch wives asked Irene to check her own winter lamp oil order. Owen's trust had become something other people could see. Caleb crossed the room after the customers thinned. He carried his hat in both hands. His voice lowered, but not enough to become private. Irene, I wondered whether you might take supper with me Friday. Owen stood on the other side of the counter, fastening his gloves. Caleb continued, nothing grand, just supper, a quiet evening with someone sensible. The word landed harder than any insult. Irene looked toward Owen. He had already heard it. His face gave nothing away as he turned toward the door. In his haste, his elbow struck the coffee tin. It fell against the counter edge, crushing the lower corner deeper before rolling beneath a chair. Owen did not stop to retrieve it. The bell above the door rang once, and he was gone. Irene found Owen's coffee tin beneath the chair, one corner newly crushed and a line of dark ground scattered across the floorboards. She brushed the coffee into her palm, not because it could be saved, but because leaving it there felt careless. By noon, the tin sat clean beside the register. Owen did not return for it. On Wednesday, he came to town for a harness fitting and tried to pass Bell Mercantile without looking through the window. Irene stepped outside before he reached the hitching rail. You forgot something. She held out the tin. Owen stopped. I thought I had it. You did not. His gaze settled on the dented corner. Looks worse. It still closes. Mostly. He reached for it, but Irene kept hold of the handle. Coffee is fresh, she said. You may as well drink 1 cup before you carry it 12 miles. For a moment, she expected him to refuse. Then he followed her inside. Eli was stacking winter blankets in the rear. Caleb had not arrived. The mercantile felt strangely private, despite the 2 customers near the stove. Irene brewed the coffee strong. As Owen's wife once had strong enough, she had said, to wake the mountains. Irene knew the phrase because Owen had repeated it only once, years earlier, while buying half a pound on the first cold morning after the funeral. She set 1 cup before him and kept 1 for herself. Owen drank without hurry. You remembered. I remember most things sold in this store. That was not sold here. No, the answer remained between them, warm as the steam rising from the cups. Owen drew the final freight invoice closer. The wagon would leave Monday, and every pound of space had already been promised. My south fence needs staples, he said, but the barn lanterns need oil. The lanterns. The cattle may push through that fence. You can mend wire in daylight. You cannot treat a sick calf in a dark barn. He looked down the columns. What would you remove? The wash basin? I have been without a proper one for 2 winters. You can be without it 1 more. His mouth shifted at the edge. Then he turned the invoice around and slid the pencil toward her. You decide. The words were quiet, yet the room heard them. Eli stopped with a folded blanket in his hands. One of the waiting customers glanced from Owen to Irene. Even Caleb, entering with snow dusting his shoulders, paused near the door. Irene marked out the wash basin, added the lamp oil, and adjusted the freight weight exactly. Owen studied the total. No one understands what that ranch needs better than you. Not even me. The silence seemed to add, it was the closest thing to trust he had ever offered in public. For 1 clean minute, Irene let herself enjoy it. Then Mrs. Dyer came from the fabric counter and smiled at Caleb. We heard about Friday supper. Sensible matches are a blessing at our age. Another woman laughed softly. 2 shops, no children underfoot, and both of you settled. Pine Ridge could not arrange it better. Caleb's face tightened with embarrassment. Nothing has been arranged. Not yet, Mrs. Dyer said. Irene set down the pencil. And not by Pine Ridge. But Owen had already stepped away from the counter. She watched him gather his gloves and lift the parcel Eli had prepared. He did not look angry. Anger would have been easier. He looked resolved. as though surrender were a form of good manners. Owen, Irene said. He stopped. Your final order is settled. I heard, you asked me to decide. And you did. He touched 2 fingers to the brim of his hat, thanked Eli, and walked out before Irene could ask the only question that mattered. Morning light had barely reached the storeroom when Eli found the tin on a shelf where Owen had left it after their coffee. There were no grounds inside. Only a narrow scrap of paper in Owen's plain hand. Eli carried it to Irene without speaking. She unfolded it beside the brass scoop. No more coffee. By Monday morning, frost had sealed the wagon ruts white, and the final freight team stood steaming outside Bell Mercantile. Irene opened Owen's tin before sunrise. A dusting of coffee clung to the seams. She brushed it out with a clean cloth, washed the metal, and worked the bent lid until it closed without catching. She did not fill it. The empty tin waited beside the brass scoop. When Owen entered, he carried the last of his freight papers beneath one arm. Snow had gathered on his shoulders. His gaze moved first to Irene, then to the tin. You cleaned it, he said. It needed cleaning. He set the papers on the counter. Eli said the wagon leaves at 10. It does. Irene checked the list one final time. Lamp oil, salt, oats, flour, harness rivets, no wash basin, no glass. Nothing that could not justify its weight through a Colorado winter. Owen watched her mark each crate. You left space for the coffee. There is no coffee. His eyes returned to the tin. Irene pushed it across the counter. The light scrape of metal against wood seemed louder than the loading outside. Owen lifted the lid. Nothing waited beneath it. No grounds, no folded warning, no reminder about salt, roads, cold, or the date of his next trip to town. His thumb rested against the bare bottom. You said no more, Irene said. I sent 3 words. They were clear ones. I thought it would make things easier. For whom? Owen closed the lid. You have a good offer before you. Caleb invited me to supper. He can offer more than a Monday errand. Irene held his gaze. Is that what you believe this was? He did not answer. Outside, a driver called for the final lamp oil crate. Eli carried it past them and kept walking, leaving the question where it belonged. Irene placed both hands on the counter. I will not keep filling something you never opened fully, she said. Not the tin. Not this conversation. You may call every note useful if that is all you can bear to name it. But I will not spend another winter pretending usefulness is the same as being wanted. Owen's face tightened, though he remained still. Some people mistake usefulness for the absence of longing. They trust the hands that remember the salt, the weather, and the road, yet never ask what those hands hope to hold. How many quiet kindnesses have you accepted without wondering what courage it took to offer them? Caleb entered, carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. He slowed when he saw Owen holding the empty tin. I can come back, he said. No, Irene answered. Say what you came to say. Caleb set the parcel down without pushing it toward her. Friday's supper was meant as an invitation, not an arrangement made by half the town. I know. I have a steady home, a decent business. I would value company in both. His offer held no cruelty and no trick. That made it harder to dismiss. I would treat you with respect, he added. You already have. Caleb waited. Irene glanced at Owen. He stood with his hat in one hand and the tin in the other, but gave her no reason to refuse a good man. She turned back to Caleb. I will not answer because Pine Ridge thinks 2 sensible people should combine their empty rooms. You deserve more than a woman choosing safety because another man chose silence. Caleb absorbed the words, then nodded once. That is fair. Irene faced Owen. And you deserve whatever your silence leaves you with. The freight driver shouted that the team was ready. Owen tied the tin beside his last crate. He looked at Irene as though he meant to speak, but Eli rang the loading bell from the platform. Owen climbed onto the wagon. The wheels began turning toward the north road, carrying the final scheduled freight into the mountains. A second bell rang before the wagon reached the edge of town. The driver reined in. Eli stepped from the freight office holding a telegram above his head. Storm shut the western pass. He called, Winter service is closed. No Monday wagon until spring. Owen looked down at the empty tin beside him. Snow followed him beyond Pine Ridge until the town disappeared behind a white curtain. He drove the freight wagon north with his shoulders bent against the wind. Drifts gathered in the low places. By the time he reached the ranch, darkness had settled over the outbuildings, and ice had formed along the harness straps. He unloaded the lamp oil first, then the salt and flour. The empty coffee tin remained tied beside the seat. Inside the house, Owen set it on the kitchen table. The room held the dry cold of a place where one man used only what he needed. One chair stood near the stove. One cup rested beside the basin. The second had remained in the cupboard since his wife died. Owen loosened the lid and looked again at the bare metal. No coffee, no folded warning, no reason to return Monday. Wind pressed snow against the windows. He crossed to the bedroom, knelt beside the cedar chest, and drew out a narrow wooden box. The first note lay on top. Cold week coming. The paper had softened at the folds and darkened where coffee oil had touched it. Beneath it waited another. Don't forget salt. Another warned that the South Road had frozen in shade. One reminded him the mercantile would close early for Christmas. One said simply, Eli saved your lamp chimneys. He had kept all of them, not because they were useful, though most had been. He had kept them because Irene's handwriting entered the house on mornings when no other voice did. Owen arranged the notes across the table. Some were no larger than 2 fingers. Others had been cut from invoices with faded numbers along one edge. He remembered the decision attached to each one. A changed road, an extra sack, a trip to town he might otherwise have postponed. One note, written the previous winter, had said, Coffee is fresh today. That Monday had marked 9 years since his wife's death. Irene had not named the date. She had only made certain he had a reason to enter a room where other people spoke to him. Owen gathered the notes and placed them inside the empty tin. The damaged lid would not close over the bundle. He pressed one corner down, wrapped a leather thong around the tin, and tied it hard enough to hold. At Bell Mercantile, Irene removed Owen's reserved coffee measure from beneath the counter. She poured the grounds back into the main bin and erased his name from the Monday shelf card. Then she completed his account without adding a note to the receipt. Caleb entered near noon. I came to ask whether you had an answer. I do. He waited. Irene folded Owen's account and placed it in the drawer. I cannot accept. Because of Marsh. Because I would be asking you to make a home around a choice I did not make freely. Caleb's disappointment showed, but he carried it quietly. Then I am glad you answered before either of us called caution happiness. He left with the same dignity he had brought. By mid-afternoon, snow thickened over Pine Ridge. 12 miles north, Owen saddled his strongest horse. The freight road was closing under drifts, but the narrower ranch trail crossed higher ground and stayed clear where wind swept the ridge bare. He tucked the tin beneath his coat, secured it with a strap, and rode. Freezing wind struck him above the timberline. Ice formed in his beard. Twice the horse slipped on exposed stone, forcing Owen to dismount and lead her through the worst of the climb. Near the ridge crest, the leather thong snapped. The tin slid beneath his coat. Its lid lifted, and several notes pressed against the opening. Owen caught it against his ribs before the wind could take them. He wrapped one arm around the tin and finished the descent one-handed, protecting Irene's papers from driven snow. Dusk had reached Pine Ridge when he came to the mercantile's rear door. Irene opened it to find him coated in frost, breathing hard. The tin clutched beneath his arm. She pulled him inside. Owen, what happened? He set one worn note in her hand. Cold week coming. The folds had nearly worn through. I opened every one, he said. Then he placed the frost-streaked tin on the counter between them. Water darkened the edges of several papers beneath the rim. Irene reached for the lid. It would not move. Irene braced the tin against the counter and tried again. The cold had tightened the bent rim, and one crushed corner had locked beneath the hinge. Owen reached for his pocket knife, but Irene shook her head. You'll cut the papers. She crossed to the coffee bin and took up the scoop he had repaired. The wire around its wooden handle had darkened from weeks of use, but it held. Eli came from the storeroom when he heard their voices. Caleb stood near the front window with 2 customers waiting out the storm. No one spoke as Irene slid the scoop's thin edge beneath the damaged rim. Hold it steady, she told Owen. He placed both hands around the tin. Irene worked slowly, easing one section at a time. Frost melted beneath her fingers and ran in narrow lines across the counter. The scoop handle creaked. For one moment, the wire binding began to slip. Then the lid lifted with a sharp metallic snap. Folded notes rose against it. packed from bottom to rim. Some were stained dark with coffee. Some had corners softened nearly round. Several were damp from the ride, their ink blurred at the edges, but still readable. Irene stared at them. Owen removed the first note and laid it flat. "East Road Soft," he said. "You wrote that last March. I took the ridge. A freight wagon lost a wheel at the crossing that afternoon." He placed another beside it. "Don't forget salt." I had forgotten. The herd would have gone short before the thaw. Another note followed. "Cold week coming." That one kept me from leaving 2 calves in the north shed. He did not read every paper. He did not need to. Each note carried the wear of being opened, folded, and opened again. Caleb moved closer, stopping at the far end of the counter. Owen set down a smaller scrap cut from an old invoice. "Coffee is fresh today," he read. His voice changed. "That Monday was 9 years since Anna died. I had planned to stay at the ranch. You gave me a reason to come to town without asking me to explain why I needed one." The room remained still. Owen looked at Irene, not at the people listening. "You thought I called these useful because I did not understand what they were." Irene's fingers rested beside the worn papers. "Did you?" "Yes." "Then why did you never say it?" His gaze dropped to the battered tin. "Because wanting something after grief felt too much like forgetting what came before? And because you had years left that I had no right to claim? That was not your choice to make for me." "No." The answer came without defense. Owen turned the tin so everyone could see the notes inside. "Irene did not merely keep my coffee filled. She kept me from letting that ranch become the only place left in my life. Every time she warned me about a road, remembered a supply, or gave me a reason to come down the mountain, she was telling me I still belonged among the living." Eli removed Owen's old shelf card from the register drawer. Instead of throwing it away, he placed it in Irene's hand with the small brass key to the locked coffee cabinet. "You decide what gets reserved," he said, not because she was his sister, because the whole room had seen what her judgment was worth. Caleb picked up his parcel. "I believe my invitation has its answer." Owen faced him. "I am sorry." Caleb shook his head. "Do not apologize for speaking late. Just do not speak halfway." He put on his hat and stepped aside. Owen gathered the notes carefully, leaving the first one between himself and Irene. "I am not asking you to fill this again as a favor," he said. "I am asking whether you would come to my table and share the coffee with me." A wagon bell sounded outside as the storm wind eased. Irene looked at the open tin, the worn notes, and the man who had finally brought his silence into the light. "As another kindness," she asked, "or as the beginning of a life we choose together?" Owen did not look toward the customers or ask the storm to cover what he meant. "As the beginning of a life we choose together," he said. "Not because you remember my salt, not because you know which road will hold. I want your chair at my table when there is nothing broken, nothing missing, and no reason for you to be there except that I hoped you would come." Irene held the first note between 2 fingers. The paper had gone soft along every fold. "And when you are afraid, I will say so. When you think you are protecting me by deciding for me, I will remember how poorly that worked." A small smile reached her before she could stop it. Owen continued, "I do not need another delivery. Irene, I want your judgment in my decisions, your voice in that house, and your company on mornings that are only mornings." The answer did not erase the years he had spent silent. It did something harder. It gave those years a boundary. Irene placed the worn note back inside the tin. "Then I will come for coffee," she said. "But I will not spend the rest of my life guessing what you refuse to say. You should not, and you will sometimes fill the tin." Owen looked at the brass scoop in her hand. "I believe I can learn." Eli turned toward the storeroom, granting them what privacy a mercantile could offer. The customers returned to the windows. No one applauded. No one needed to. The space beside Owen at the counter no longer looked accidental. The storm left the north trail packed hard by morning. Irene rode to the Marsh ranch with a parcel of fresh grounds tied behind her saddle, not hidden beneath an invoice and not marked as store business. Owen met her at the gate. Inside, the kitchen was warmer than she remembered. He had pulled the second chair from the wall and set it across from his own. 2 cups waited on the table. They spread the damp notes on clean cloth near the stove. Irene flattened each corner beneath a spoon, while Owen turned them as the paper dried. One note had lost half a word to melted snow. Another carried a brown ring where coffee had soaked through years earlier. Owen brought faded mercantile twine from the tin and tied the dry notes into a careful bundle. "You kept the useless ones too," Irene said. "Which were those?" She lifted a scrap that read, "Eli says your buttons arrived." That coat had been missing 2 buttons for a month. That was not mountain survival. "No," Owen said. "It was proof somebody noticed." Irene placed the bundle beside the open tin. On a fresh order sheet, Owen wrote enough coffee for 2 people through spring. Then he handed her the pencil. She added lamp oil, salt, and 1 proper wash basin. Owen read the final line. "You finally allowed it? The cattle are fed. The barn is lit. A man can wash his face." He filled the kettle while she measured the grounds. When Irene reached for the cups, Owen had already set one before her. Neither spoke Anna's name as an apology, and neither treated the future as a replacement for what had been. Her memory remained in the strong coffee and in the man who had survived loving her. Irene's place did not require that memory to disappear. Mountain Dawn reached the windows slowly, touching the scratched tin, the tied notes, and the 2 chairs drawn close to the table. For the first time in years, Owen Marsh filled 2 cups before the mountains woke.